In 30 seconds, you will be witness to one of the greatest online events in the history of, well, online events. Descript proudly brings to you a topic that you deeply care about and whose name is the title of this online event. I'm Don. I am not your host. I am an overdub stock voice included for free with Descript. So, now, let's meet someone who actually works here.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever on earth you are joining us. Our focus this week in our Descript live stream is Podcast Growth 101, how to build a team or how to build an effective podcast with a team of one. I'm Jay LaBeouf. I am your weekly host, and I'm also head of business development here at Descript. If you're new to Descript, welcome. Descript is a tool that allows anybody to edit audio and video as easily as editing text. I'd like to say that we're becoming, especially over the past year, a bit of an industry standard for how podcasts are created. And we really strive to invest in the editing workflow to make that as easy as possible for you. But many of you have often told us that you have more challenges to getting your podcast online. There's something holding you back. And that's what this podcast is about. This webinar is about. Whatever we're doing, this might be a podcast at some point too, but right now it's a webinar. And what I want you to do is I want you to tell me on the live stream, what's holding you back from doing your podcast? Maybe you've edited some material. Maybe you haven't even recorded it yet, but what's holding you back? What are the obstacles in your way? Drop that in the YouTube chat on the YouTube live stream. And our guest, Mark Asquith, the self-proclaimed British podcast guy. Mark, is that okay to call you that?
Everyone else called me it for years, Jay. I had to just make it a proclamation a few years ago. So you can call me that all day long, sir.
Fantastic. So I have my friends, the British podcast guy, the CEO and co-founder of Rebel-Based Media, the company that makes Captivate that Descript integrates with, the company that also makes the Podcast Success Academy, and so many more. Mark, thanks for joining us as our in-house podcast growth expert. Welcome to the live stream.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure, and thanks for hosting this. Thank you for everyone that's commented so far. It's fantastic to see people like Col online. I've got to say as well that the Muck Around and Find Out has put a comment in about the intro, Jay, making them laugh, and I was behind the scenes in tears on this one because I've never seen an intro like that. That is fantastic. It was hilarious.
Wonderful. Well, fantastic. It was. It's what we do to entertain ourselves at Descript, and we should change it. Actually, it makes me think we need to kind of change it a little bit. That entire voiceover at the beginning is all overdub. So it's just as simple as somebody sending in new text. So if you have new ideas, new texts, send them to me anytime. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us a little bit about who you are, why you're the British podcast guy, and then we'll go through some of the reasons that people feel blocked.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So I've been in podcasting for a long time now, nearly 10 years, which is startling. I must be getting very, very old. And I run Rebel-Based Media. We're a podcast tech company, and we make Captivate.fm, where we help thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasters to host and grow their podcast every single day. So we're an online, obviously, host, distribution, analytics, and marketing platform for podcasters, where you can host as many podcasts as you want for one cost. You don't pay per podcast or per RSS feed. And me personally, I've been podcasting since around early 2013. So I'm coming up, like I said, to a decade in the industry, produced over 1,100 episodes. I run varying podcasts from my own show, which is the Podcast Accelerator, which helps busy podcasters to build their audience, and also a Star Wars podcast. I run a company called Rebel-Based Media. It's probably no surprise that I'm a Star Wars fan. So I run that in my spare time as well. And what's cool about that is that I sort of get two sides of the story. I get me as the independent podcaster that is able to grow my show, Spark of Rebellion, and start that from scratch and just build it and incrementally tweak it and just see what we can do with that without the leverage of a big brand behind it. And I get to be the CEO of the company and speak on stages all over the world about podcasting and see the industry from the inside. So it's quite a nice position to be in. educate all over the world on podcasting, Podcast Movement, Podfest, Berkeley up near UJ, Harvard University, many of the conferences here in London and Europe. So yeah, podcasting it's my 8 hours per day job, Jay.
Oh, fantastic. So I think people are leaning in a little bit more now. You clearly know what you're doing. I am so thrilled to dive in. Let's first hear from our audience and bring up a couple of the things that are holding people back. All right, so muck around and find out. Held back, deeply confused about distribution. If you make a recording but don't know where to put it into the world effectively. Great. Let's bring up a few more. All the steps in order to get it to be launched. Great. Nothing's really holding me back. Well, that's outstanding. I'm curious, WCBC, if you are actually hitting the goals that you've set out for yourself. We'll talk about that at the end. Thank you. I don't know. I think Mark's background looks pretty good too.
Smoke and mirrors, Jay. Smoke and mirrors.
Smoke and mirrors. Awesome. All right. So, Mark, let's start off, now that we've kind of set the stage a little bit, talk about podcast branding. This is something that we were talking about earlier. You can tell me a little bit about what the podcast brands are, what they're not, and basically, if I'm getting going in this space, what might I want to consider?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective to start to consider podcast branding. Podcast branding is much like any other brand. You know, it's about how you make people feel, but podcasting is quite challenging. And what I mean by that is that I don't think there are many other industries that are in the position that podcasting is in right now, where you have this willingness from so many people to get involved and willingness from so many people to want to start a podcast. And on the flip side, you've got so many gurus teaching you exactly what to do, but in an industry that is changing overnight. And I mean overnight, like today, Apple, rightly so in my opinion, changed the subscribe button to follow. That's it. They've changed it. It's done. It's out. Okay, that's in the beta. It will be a big change. And it's a huge barrier that's overcome for people. That is how quickly the podcasting space is moving. And what tends to happen is in any space, you get your early adopters that will do well. You know, they will do well and they will then teach those things to other people, but they stop working. These things stop working. And what tends to happen is that all the advice that we follow from 3, 4, 5 years ago starts to just become less and less effective. And branding is at the center of that. And what I mean by that is that podcast branding used to be something that you just did alongside. You'd get what people call a podcast logo, which is the square cover art. It's not a logo. It's cover art. It's an album cover. And it didn't kind of matter what it looked like, because 5 years ago or 10 years ago or however long in the past you look back, there were only a fraction of the podcasts that there are today. When I started in podcasting, there was less than 200,000 podcasts in the world. By the end of April, there'll be 2 million. And the thing is, podcast branding used to be a side note. It used to be something that you would just throw together. Today, it's an experience. Today, it's how you make people feel. So it's not just about your square logo, the cover art logo. It's not just about the fonts that you choose, the typefaces that you choose. It's not about how you set the language up for your show, because that's a big part of it. It's something we can maybe get to later, because that's a big differentiator. But it's also about how you include people, how you involve people, because to stand out in 2021 and beyond as a podcaster, your brand is an entire experience. It's the Coca-Cola experience. It's insert brand X, the Apple experience, whatever you want to feel like you associate with a brand in the space that you admire. Your job as a podcaster is to be the best feeling brand in your niche. So it's a great example of this. Descript is a fantastic brand. Yes, you've got fantastic technology. Yes, it's fun to use overdub. Yes, it's fun to create audiograms. But the fact of the matter is that other people will do transcription. That's inevitable in the world. But they don't do video intros like you do, Jay. and they don't use their own product to do that, and they don't invite people to send in new scripts that you will then overdub through. And that is what you have to do as a podcaster. So your brand is really how you put your arm around the audience. It's not just visual. And for me, that's the core tenet of podcast marketing. And we'll get to a lot more of that later. But the core of branding is basically your personality, right at the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
Wrapped around that is all of the things that you do to make people feel welcome. We'll talk about that in a bit more depth later. And then the outer shell is just the visuals, the colors, the typeface, some of the language that you use in your podcast cover art. So that's what branding is in a nutshell. I know we can go a little bit deeper into that. There's a lot more to say on that, but that is the top level look at what podcast branding really means.
So that is a great overview, and I'm hoping to make it even more concrete. Tell me about the brand, for example, like break down the Freakonomics podcast. Like that means something to people. If I tell people a Freakonomics style podcast or a podcast like Freakonomics, I think it carries something. So is that what you mean?
It is, and Freakonomics is a decent example of that. In that the people that love Freakonomics love it for a reason. But what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to come down and I'm going to use something a little bit close to home, if that's all right. So I'm going to use something that we can probably all sort of get along with. So let's use something that everyone knows, which is something like cereal. And I use cereal as this example because it's so big and it got so many people listening to podcasts. And it was the breakout for the podcast industry in many people's eyes. But it was produced by a huge, huge company. But it was about the people. It was about Sarah Koenig. It was about her team. And it was about Adnan Syed and everyone that was involved in that. Now, a certain type of person listens to Serial. And the podcast brand develops a fandom. So it develops like a Star Wars fandom would. It develops a fandom like DC or Marvel Comics would. And that's what Serial does. Now, why does it do that? Well, this is why it's such a great example, Jay, is because look at the cover art for Serial. There's nothing on it. There's nothing on it except the word Serial. And this is what people get a little bit wrong. They go all out and they spend a fortune on design, which is great. You have to look good.
Yeah.
But they confuse that with not really thinking through what a brand is. Now, again, one of the reasons that I use Serial is that there's a very distinct tonality to Serial. There's a very distinct tone of voice that it has, a very distinct objectivity, and a very distinct inbuilt and innate trust that comes from listening to Serial, because that's how it's being produced. That is the brand that it puts out. Now, let's bring that down even further to the you and me level, the you and I level. What can we do? There's something that actually, there are two things that you can easily do today to not upskill, but kind of level up your audio brand and your podcasting brand. And none of them are visual. The first thing that you can do is develop something that I call a presence promise, a promise to be present. Okay. So, Jay, you and I, we spoke on email, we've spoken on Zoom a few times. We've got to know each other a little bit. I know how you sound. I know what the color of your eyes are because they're very striking blue. I know exactly kind of how you approach things from a biz dev perspective because we've worked together. And I know that if I say to you, Jay, can we have a chat? You will be around and you'll deliver the thing that I need in a very specific way, and you'll always do it very, very well. And that halo effect will then move up to the Descript brand. Okay, so I now think of Descript as this fantastic organization. Now, Chris and Harmony and everyone else that works on it, and Pat and everyone that we've done work with, they are just representations of what started for me with you. Now, that sounds very abstract. So what does it mean for podcasters? Well, what are you doing every time you record a podcast? You're getting this thing in front of you and you are recording directly into it, and someone's getting that and they're popping it in these earbuds and they're popping it inside their ears. So this direct connection that you and me built via email and Zoom and working together on BizDev,
right?
Podcasters are building every day. Every time they publish, straight back and forth, straight back and forth. So it's a direct line between people. But what's missing? It's this. It's the fact that I can see your blue eyes and that you've got a great looking camera setup. And
thank you.
You're welcome. And that things look fantastic and that you and I can smile and we can laugh to each other. That's the missing connection in podcasting. So I developed something a few years ago called a presence promise, excuse me, which is you guys do this actually inadvertently on your YouTube channel as I did some research. You do office hours. And we do office hours with our podcast launch accelerator people. It's a free course that we run. We've got a Facebook group. We run office hours at 11 a.m. Eastern every single Friday. That is a promise to be present. It's a presence promise. My brand now in the industry, not because I've carefully cultivated it and not because I've carefully sort of faked authenticity, but because I turn up. When I say I'm going to turn up, my brand in the industry now is approachable, friendly. You can talk to Mark. You can ask him questions. I get people asking me questions about podcast growth all the time, like on email. And very often when I say, well, look, come along, I'm there on Friday. I will answer the question. And then when I say, hey, we've got a question from Jay, fantastic question. Congratulations on securing that sponsor or on the birth of your new child. Like all of these genuine relationship pieces matter. Now, what happens? Why is that important for your brand? Well, when someone asks, who's the person to listen to in podcasting? Who should I get my podcast education from? Where would you recommend I get this stuff? Get it from Mark, because guess what? Unlike all the other people, if you've got a question, he will be there every single week. They don't need the email. They don't need social. Because I've done it since 2015. They know that I will be there. That's a presence promise. So that's number one for your brand. That's how to upscale your brand. Number two is develop something called notables, 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 something notable about your podcast. And it doesn't have to be much. And a lot of people do this that you will probably admire, that you'll know and that you'll admire. Okay. So a notable in my case with my old podcast, I did a podcast called Excellence Expector, which was before I got into sort of podcast education. The brand was inspired by a Steve Jobs quote, which was, not many people are used to working in an environment where excellence is expected. And it was a business-led podcast for startup founders like myself. And I had this catchphrase right at the end, which was, all right, guys, thank you so much for listening. It's been a real pleasure. And remember, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel. To this day, people cite that back to me. I walk around podcast movement and they're like, whoa, don't forget, the more you expect from yourself. And then I have to finish the catchphrase off back to them. Now, why is that important for your brand? Well, if you were in 2012 and 2013 and there's 200,000 podcasts, you can create a podcast about anything and you will get listeners just because not that many other podcasts exist about that thing that you talk about.
Right.
But in 2021, your brand has to stand out. And what better way to stand out than giving people something that they can own? Now, it doesn't have to be a catchphrase. It can be a character. Now, I'll tell you another small story on why this works. Yesterday, and this is genuinely happened. It was the last thing. It's 20 past 5 on an evening now here where I am. And it was about this time last night. We get a video from a customer at Captivate. And he thanked everyone on the team, including our support bot called Charlie, which just recommends articles that might help in the interim, between us getting back to them. He thanked the bot. That is a notable piece of the Captivate team because we'd taken time to make it notable. And this can be segments in your podcast. It can be like I'm working on a new podcast about podcasting, which Jay, I've got you on right here next to me. I've got you on a list of people to have on the show. It's a show that's very tongue-in-cheek, but it's intended to make the podcast industry accessible to the enthusiasts, not just the OGs that have been in it for 20 years. Yeah. So we're going a little bit tongue-in-cheek. We've got some like old school Family Guy, like sort of soap opera style stings for in between our segments. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is something called the Flattering Ram, this is a podcast about podcasting. But I can guarantee it will stand out because there's a segment in there where we do nothing more than pick something or someone random in podcasting and we flatter them. So next week I might do the show and we'd play the sling. It would be, flattering some really cheesy thing. And I would just go, hey, this week's flattering ram is not Jay LaBeouf, but it's Jay LaBeouf's new camera. This is wonderful. Well done, Jay. Fantastic looking. And look, you're smiling now. And it's the combination of that random notable thing and this little memorable sting that we'll do will make you remember that. So these notables are really important for your podcast marketing and for your brand. I know the question was about brand, and I've gone into this, but these are two things that you can do today that I almost guarantee will accelerate the way that your podcast grows, because no one remembers the things that aren't memorable. They only remember the things that trigger, whether it's a smile, like the little flattering ram did, or whether it's an emotional reaction, whether it's an education sort of light bulb going off, or whether it's something that they can really hook to themselves, or the fact that you put an arm around when they needed it and you were there with the presence promise. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but I believe that they are so valuable in boosting your podcast growth, because if you do that, you will stand out from the crowd because no one is doing those two things en masse.
Great. So just recapping the two things, a presence promise and notables. So maybe we'll take a quick check-in. I want to make our audience, our live viewers, as active as part of this as possible. Harmony, anything? Harmony's, by the way, if you see me talking my screen, I'm not calling my screen Harmony. Harmony is a new product specialist and customer success manager at Descript, who is working the backstage today. Harmony, anything popping up? Mark, what do you think?
All right, we're going to go down the SEO tunnel. Let's do this.
Let's do it.
Everything is a search engine these days. Let's be honest. Netflix is a search engine. Shows want to be at the top of Netflix's recommended list, just like they do Google. That's why search buttons exist, to help us with relevant responses to the queries that we have at any given time. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, they're all search engines. So what can you do to power your SEO? Well, there's two things that you've got to understand with that. Three things you've got to understand with that. Number one, people like Google are really good at searching things. And what Google wants to do, and I'm talking very specifically about Google here, is that Google, unlike Apple and unlike Spotify, who are focusing on, here's my show, subscribe or follow it, and you will now be a follower of me or Jay or whomever. What Google is doing what it always does, which is surfacing relevant things at relevant times. And if one of those things happens to be an audio episode of a podcast that helps with a query that someone has, then so be it. So keyword research in the traditional sense, wherein, you find low competition, relatively high traffic, decent opportunity-based SEO phrases and keywords, that exists for podcasting in no other way than you would do normal SEO. So identify those keywords and do content around them, because that works. Google is looking to surface that content. If you talk to the Google team, they are very, very, or certainly the last time I spoke to them, they were very focused on surfacing episodes, not shows. So they'll show an episode in the search results. So that's the first thing, Christopher. The second thing to understand is that you can't game this. Apple in particular has got very, very, very tight on stopping people gaming their SEO. So what you used to see is like, here is Entrepreneur 101 podcast featuring Jay and featuring Mark Asquith and 50 other entrepreneurs, all in the title and all in the author field, so that they were theoretically gaming it.
Right.
Apple is dropping podcasts for that. They don't want that, okay? Instead, what do they want? Well, that's item 3, and this is where Descript comes in to a degree as well. Transcription is becoming more and more important, okay? So not so much from putting transcripts in your show notes, but behind the scenes, what Apple and Spotify are doing is they're searching in audio. So they are looking for phrases. They are looking for things that we're talking about, and they're actually transcribing behind the scenes in order to surface relevant shows and episodes when someone searches for something. Now, what does that mean for you, Christopher? Well, what that means is that let's assume you've identified keyword X, how to make a podcast with Descript. And you think, well, wait a sec, there's some opportunity here. Let's try and rank for that thing. You could do a series of episodes on it where you naturally talk about, here's how you make an episode of your podcast with Descript. Let's use the overdub feature. And then episode 2, let's use the new correction feature by pressing the letter E. Thank you for that, Jay. That was saved my bacon. So that kind of approach, Christopher, you can really adopt. Think about it, include it in your audio, and optimize your title, your subtitle, and then the last bonus tip is use an Apple Podcasts episode summary. So in your host like Captivate, don't just use your show notes. There's a little summary box. Use that. Think about it as a meta description. So yeah, SEO is vital to marketing. So yeah, use those tips. I think you'll make some progress.
Awesome. Not so much a question as a request for topic. And this is great. I was going to go here as well about building up your audience. Using the example you had before, Mark, I'm going to do the entrepreneur podcast and I'm going to cover all things entrepreneurship, from opening your own, small grocery store to scaling your next Fortune 500 SaaS company. That doesn't work anymore, right?
It doesn't. It's not as easy for that to work. Where one of my biggest problems with entrepreneurial podcasts is the entrepreneurs are always telling you to niche, but then they're trying to sell a course on email marketing and then podcasting and then how to do webinars. And then, so you think, well, wait a second, if you're teaching me to niche, what's your niche? That for me is like this weird juxtaposition. Now, building an audience in a niche market, I think is really, really fascinating. Now, it's a great opportunity. And the reason for this is, so look, the cash flow contractor, I'm assuming it's helping. I don't know, I could have this way wrong, but it could be something to do with helping contractors to free up cash flow in their freelance business, or in their contracting business, or it might be a financial services platform, whatever that might be. I'm just making those two assumptions. Either way, the second you get to the point of thinking, wait a sec, I can create some content in this and I can probably do all right from it. Two things have already happened. You've recognized that you've got competence and confidence in this field. And number two, you've had the guts and the willingness to go out there and say, I am going to publish public-facing content. By virtue of those two things happening, you are already the expert. You already know what you're doing. But the thing that most people forget is that if you get to that point, you're already really well thought of in your niche. So what's the best way to build your podcast in this niche? Is just do the exact stuff that you did to build your business way back when in this niche, because you already have those connections. Go and speak at the events. I podcasting was a really tight niche when I got into it, and I wanted to build a business in podcasting. So what did I do? Day one, I went and spoke at every event that I could. I've been speaking at Podcast Movement since 2014, 2015-ish, and just speak at everything. So that, the idea one is you probably already sat on everything you need to build in that niche market. If you don't have that, if you're entering a new niche, you've got to become known. You can only excel in a niche if you have ideas that other people in the niche will really jump on board with, or if you already have an advantage, aka you've been in the niche before. Yeah. If you've got ideas and you aren't already in that niche, the easiest way to do it is you've got to own an opinion. So you get an opinion that may be a little contrarian or that may be very forward thinking. I remember about 4 years ago, I wrote a piece that posited that maybe podcasting didn't need RSS feeds. I got lambasted for it. I got hammered in the space by some real industry experts. Guess what? Apple and Spotify both now have podcasts that don't have RSS feeds. So you've got to have something that will gather people, that will potentially even divide, that will maybe repel the people that are really stoically defending one thing. Where if you have an idea that will attract people, that's how you can really dive into a niche quickly. And again, there's so much more I could talk about on that one, but that's sort of the top level. Right. So we've got a question about downloads. Oh, right. We've got half an hour left, Jay. Okay. Right. where to start on this one.
Well, maybe break it down. Is that what they should be focusing on?
That's where I was going to go first. Actually, it's a good point. So downloads are the only thing that we measure right now, and that's because we can't really reliably measure listeners. There's an entire privacy question set that comes with measuring listeners. So when it comes to measuring downloads, bear in mind they're the only things that we have to measure right now. So at the top level, we've got to be specifying our goals. You know, I'm not going to get too much into the goal setting, but remember that downloads are usually only a means to an end. You know, they only remain subservient to a bigger goal throughout their entire life cycle. You know, if your goal is more signups for your SaaS and your conversion rate is 2%, 5%, 10%, stick more downloads in, theoretically, you scale more signups. That's just very basic kind of SaaS logic and conversion logic. But how do you get those downloads? Right. So this is something that I call a concept that I call the podcast discoverability triangle. And there's a precursor to it that I'm going to quickly give you. And then I'm going to dig into these 3 types of people that you have to start nurturing. All right. So the first thing you need to get more downloads is a solid and repeatable podcast episode marketing process. So what that means is that most podcasters, let's say they release on a Wednesday, all right? And I do this, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. On a Monday and or a Tuesday, I'll go to Descript and I've designed some lovely cover art sort of backgrounds for my audiograms and did that in Canva and pop them into Descript, and then I'll drop it into a folder, this little audiogram from Descript, and Zapier will automate it through Captivate right through to the point where it will tweet everything a few times and say, here's what's coming up on the podcast. And I do that on a Monday, on a Tuesday. Then on a Wednesday, I release. Again, promote it during the day, promote it on a Thursday. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I'll do a bit of, in case you missed it, here's an audiogram. In case you missed it, here's a link. In case you missed it, here's a takeaway. So that's my what I call the repeatable episode marketing process that I do every time I release an episode. All right. And you have to have a good one of those. That's the first thing to do. Mm-hmm. The problem is that's where most people stop. They think that is podcast marketing, and it's not. That's podcast promotion. That's just basic repeatable marketing. Okay. That's fine. You need it. But most people stop there, which leaves for you, Brentney, a fantastic opportunity, because there are 3 other strategic plays that you can make with your podcast. All right. So in my view, there are 3 types of people that you can attract to your podcast. And I'm going to give you some strategies on how to do them. Okay. So if you can open up these 3 people, or 3 types of people, you will boost your downloads and you'll get to people that not many other podcasters are getting to. Okay. So I call this the discoverability triangle in podcasting. Those 3 types of people are people that don't know about podcasting, but that love what you talk about. Number 2, people that know about podcasting, but have got no idea who you are. And then people number 3, the people who would ordinarily be willing to tell someone about your podcast, but you've not done enough to get them to do it. So let's break those down, because this is a strong marketing strategy, and it's different for each person and each podcast because it depends on the niche, like the actual tactics you use to get to them. But strategically, if you nail this, you will grow. Okay. So let's think about these people who love what you talk about, but they don't know about podcasting. So Jay, let's assume that you love Star Wars just as much as I do, but you have got no idea about what a podcast is. Now, I live in a fairly small village in the British countryside. Okay, I'm in these little hills. It's quaint, it's cute. There are little shops, but most of these people in the village have seen Star Wars. But do they all listen to my Star Wars podcast? Of course they don't. Why? Because 50% of them don't know about me. 50% of them don't have a clue what a podcast is. Now, what would happen if I started at a real basic level talking about the fact that I'm into Star Wars, and I produce not a podcast, but this on-demand Netflix style audio that you can get at any time that talks about the thing that you love. And by the way, lovely to see you in the shop this morning. That is a really important mechanism that you can then scale up. So imagine a marketing strategy. Again, what most people do for their podcast is that they will take an episode and they will market that episode and say, hey, I had Jay on the show, subscribe. I had Jay on the show. We talked about Descript and how fantastic transcriptions are and fantastic audiogram features and why you should audiogram for your business. Go and listen to the episode. Go and listen to the episode. That's all I do. What if I created a marketing strategy that was, look, you are a busy entrepreneur. You're a busy creator, a busy podcaster. What if I told you about a way to help automate some of that workflow, and all you had to do to learn that was to subscribe or follow this on-demand audio that you can get on your phone right now? Would you give it a whirl? Well, if you would, here are the 3 steps you need to take to get it. And using something like Captivate, we've got something called a single subscription link. We might have to change that to single follow link. Single subscription link, which like ours is just sparkofrebellion.com/listen. That /listen is just a created page automatically by Captivate with the icons to go to Spotify and Apple and wherever. It's easy. So if you could create strategies and marketing and tactics that attract those people that want what you have, but that don't care whether it's on-demand audio or podcasting or where it comes from, that's a strong mechanism to get more listeners. Now, let's scale that through to type of person number 2. And remember, no one's doing this in podcasting. The vast majority, I'm talking, 95% of podcasters don't do any of this. The top percentile do. The Jordan Harbinger of the world, they do this, okay? Where you will take a podcast that people know about, something like, let's assume, okay, now let's talk about the Descript show, and we want to get more listeners for the Descript show, and we want to target more podcasters. So these people know how to listen to podcasts. They just don't know that the show from Descript exists. Well, what's the best way to do that? It's for Jay to give me something for my podcast in podcasting, to say, Mark, here, dude, there's something that will not only promote my podcast to your audience, but that will, and here's the kicker, that will help you out. So if Jay emailed me and said, Mark, here's a 30-second promo for my podcast. Would you like to feature it? I'd be like, well, I mean, that's a sponsor slot, man. It's going to cost a little bit. Or maybe I'd just, because I know Jay, I'd be like, yeah, fine. Okay, let's do it. But what if Jay emailed me and said, Mark, listen, summer's coming up. You're probably going to be away on holiday. What about if I just did an episode and we just collaborated and I was co-host? What about if I interviewed you?
Right.
I'd be, this is fantastic, Jay. Of course. Yes. Take some pressure off me. And it would be, hey, this is Jay from Descript, the all-in-one transcription, overdub, and podcast and audio marketing tool, XYZ. You would nail that down and you would get all the exposure. Okay. Now, if you can do that, if you can offer other podcasters in your niche a way to alleviate a little bit of their workload whilst putting you in front of their audience, that will work. Okay. Now, how do I know that works? Well, that is the first thing that I did ever in podcasting. When I wasn't in podcasting, I was like, I want to get into podcasting. What shall I do? I did that and it worked. Now some of the biggest people that I spoke to, people like Evo Terra and Daniel J. Lewis, they're now advisors to Captivate, all based and predicated on one email from me 7 years ago saying, what about if I did some work with you and I just guested, or I did a guest hosting slot? So that's a vital thing. If you can do that. Now, what I recommend with that, it sounds like a lot of work. Just block some time, all right? Say, right, 1 day a month, I do a morning where I do this kind of work, okay? And just book that in. Those 2 things on their own are huge for podcast marketing because no one is doing them. What a pleasant surprise it would be to see that type of marketing going on, all right? And you will stand out from the crowd. Remember, back to your brand, stand out. The third thing is letting people who would automatically and want to share your podcast know what the heck to do to share it. Now, there are 2 sides to this. There's a tech side and there's the relationship side. So what most people will do is this. They'll go, hey, I've got Jay on the podcast. This is Ace. Jay, you've been a guest. Here are 50 assets. Can you share them to your audience? All right. Standard, common, fine. Everyone does that. Some people share it. Some people don't. But how do you activate listeners? How do you get listeners to do the very, very thing? Well, what you do is you make it really clear what you want them to do. And just stop me if this sounds familiar. Thank you so much for listening to the show. Jay, you've been a wonderful guest. Now, you guys out there, if you would like to subscribe, leave a review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, or indeed Podchaser, that would really, really help. And hey, if you like the show, give us a tweet. How many people do that? Okay, everyone does that. What do I do with that? What do I do with that? I've got no idea. What do I pick my phone up? Do I tell a friend? Do I screenshot? Do I tweet?
You've given me. I'm frustrated by it every time I hear Mark, because you've given me 12 calls to action. So effectively, you've given me the Cheesecake Factory menu and said, like, what do you want to eat right now? I'm like, this is too much. I don't have time.
That is exactly. I don't have time. Exactly. And let's now take that and apply context to it. So you completely nailed it. I don't have time. I'm frustrated. There are 12 calls to action. All right. And guess where I put that? I put it at the end. No one listens to the end because the content's finished. Okay. So what we have to do is apply context to this. Okay. So throughout any given podcast, there will be a range of salient points. There always will be. And Descript is actually a really great way of identifying these, by the way. I use this internally with the team to say, wait a sec, this is a very pertinent piece of the podcast. And that's where we create the audiograms and so on. Mm-hmm. And that's where you should be adding your call to action. Notice one call to action. So what we do, the way that we get these super fans to engage and to share is that we say, wow, Jay's just said that he gets really frustrated with 12 calls to action right at the end of a podcast. Do you struggle with that? Let me know on Twitter at Mr. Asquith. What's your biggest struggle with this particular thing? Now, what does that do? It gets people think, yes, this is me. It gets alignment. It gets the ability to say, Jay knows right now that I want him to pick up his phone and tweet me at this point. And there are other tech mechanisms we can use. We've got various other bits of things that we could do with this one, but that's a real base example. Now, as the host, what does that give me the opportunity to do? To reply. And to do what? Right back to the beginning. Build a friendship, build a relationship, throw in the notables, throw the presence promise in. Wow, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. Hope to see you on Monday or Friday, whenever we do the presence promise at 11 a.m. Eastern. And we build and we nurture that relationship. Now, the real kicker with this one is if they do it publicly, on Twitter, again, very basic example, what do we get the ability to do? Quote, retweet. Yep. Thank you so much, Jay. This has been wonderful. Fantastic, fantastic stuff. Hey, by the way, if you're wondering what the heck Jay is talking about, here's a link to that episode, or here's an audiogram with that episode in there. So again, it sounds so basic. Just even saying it out loud sounds basic. But again, what we're looking for here is an edge. What gives us that 5% point of differentiation between other podcasts? And it's these three things. Now, just to recap, Run, Eat, Drink podcast has mentioned, can we just recap those three strategic marketing plays? So yes, very, very quickly. You need 3 marketing strategies in place, and they should all run at all times, okay? Just like any company, you would have a range of strategic plays in place at any given time to scale. Number 1, create a marketing strategy that will target people who love what you talk about, but don't know about podcasts. Teach them how to listen to podcasts in 3 simple steps. Number 2, work out mechanisms, usually collaborating with other hosts will do this. Work out mechanisms wherein you can access people who know how to listen to podcasts, but don't know how to listen to you. Then number 3, target people who will naturally be wanting to share what you do and maybe tune in all the time, but are confused by your breadth of calls to action at the end. Give them context and give them one single way to share and show appreciation. And if you do that, you will attract some people that have never heard of you. And it's a huge thing that you can do, again, right now.
That's great. That's great, Mark. And what you also did there, granted with some prompting, was go back in and kind of restate the core points that you talk about. It's that very basic principle of like people need to hear something 3 times in order to do it, and to really kind of encapsulate it. So thank you for sharing that. And for those of you that want to read more about this, we're going to share some links on our social media after this. You can follow us at Descript app on whatever platform you so choose. See, Mark, I listen. I'm trying to put stuff into play.
I like this.
All right. So cool. Love Descript. Help me build with a team of one. Let's talk about repurposing content into shorter format teasers. Does that help you build the audience? Is it worth it?
Okay. So yes, yes is the short answer. Audiograms, I'll be honest, I was on the fence about this, and I'm still on the fence about what they can do for your podcast. And I'm saying that from a place of positivity, because I think that if you use them correctly, they can help. The sad thing is I see people using them incorrectly. Now, the reason that I'm saying that is a lot of people, what they want to do is actually refactor content. So there's a difference between repurposing and refactoring. Refactoring is where you take content A that is in a circular box. It's just a nice little circular box, and you open the box and you listen to the podcast, and you put it in a square box for YouTube, and you put something over the top of it, and it kind of doesn't work too well for you. It's great as an outlet. It's there as a backup. It's there for long tail discovery, but it might not help you to grow your YouTube channel because it's not intended for that medium. Okay.
Right.
Now, where short form content comes in and repurposing comes in, where Descript does such a good job of this, and I actually use Descript. You guys are the first people that have made me use audiograms. Didn't want to use them before, never used them. You guys have made me want to do that. So the way I use it is to think about a marketing funnel where midway through this marketing funnel, not the broad stuff at the top where it's broadcasted, a little bit further down where it's okay. So people have kind of, they know me a little bit on Twitter. They've maybe seen me on a webinar with Descript. They know kind of roughly what I do. I'm in sort of podcast education stuff. What can I do now? Well, I give them a snippet, and I take, like I said earlier, those salient pieces, and I put them out as audiograms. So yes, content repurposing will help, but I don't want you to confuse that for, well, I'll go put my entire library on Instagram and then on YouTube and on LinkedIn and on Facebook. For now, when you're a business of one, that all comes later when you're Gary V. When you're a business of one, choose one medium. And if it's podcasting, that's brilliant. If it's YouTube, whatever, that's also great. Choose one and use the other channels to drive to the main channel. Peripherals, audiograms, everything else that you'd expect, these teasers that go on YouTube and so on. So yeah, it can definitely help when used in the right way.
Oh, that's fantastic. With one thing I want to do, you've been very generous in talking about how you use Descript. Just want to share my screen really quick and show a few folks kind of what you're talking about if they're not as familiar. I had the Descript window, and where'd it go? There we go. Awesome. So we're seeing Descript. So this is actually a podcast that I helped produce, the Drop the Mic Music Industry Conversations podcast. We have this final draft, which is here, but maybe I just want to excerpt this episode where we're actually talking about what the episode is actually going to cover. So with this, what Mark was talking about is creating audiograms pretty quickly. I can just click on the share button, export an audiogram. And so because you already have a transcript, because you've maybe spent a few minutes, actually investing in creating the transcript, making it look good, you can see a couple of different templates you can create right here. And of course, Mark was saying, the background image, so we could very easily select our background image, logo for our site, choose our show image, whatever you want to do, just drag it in there, and then it'll look pretty darn good. What's kind of cool is you can do it very quickly. Sorry about all the notifications. Apparently I have to be somewhere. Click here. It's published. It's rendering on my desktop in the meantime. And one other thing I thought it'd be useful to show, Mark, was actually how content makes its way from Descript to Captivate. We haven't talked much about Captivate, the product. So let me show how you can get your material easily from Descript into Captivate, and then you can tell the audience a little bit why about what you think is the unique differentiator about Captivate and why you built it. I'm just going to take this short snippet of my podcast, Disrupting the Live Music Industry. Click on Share, Export, and then under the Cloud Export button. So Cloud Export, this means everything will be rendered to the cloud. So you don't have to take up any CPU time. I can basically push this button under More that says Captivate. And then you'll see right here, what do you want the episode to be called? And then hit Publish. Now, what this is going to do is this kicks off rendering in the cloud. So it's not taking any CPU time at all. It's just going on. This is going to take a few minutes if you have, let's say, a 40-minute episode, because everything has to render in the cloud with your high-quality assets. Now I say continue with Captivate, and what's going to actually happen on a totally different monitor, which is not where I want it to be. So now I will go back and reshare that monitor. Thank you all very much. But this buys me time to get the cloud render done. And now I will share. There we go. This looks like it. Now we can see this window pop up. Do you want to? So I already have my show already created, ready to accept the episode. Do you want to import? I say create the episode. The audio comes in, the transcription comes in, and now I have a chance to include a subtitle and some show notes. You see my media file is already here, and I can kind of go in and add that other information. And I'm like, what? A click away from publishing? All right, so soup to nuts, that's just kind of how you can get material from Descript into Captivate. Mark, I do have to say, what was in it? Why create a podcast hosting platform? I'll even snarkily say, isn't this a solved problem?
It is a solved problem, but it's never about being better. It's always about indifferent. I could always use a transcription service for my transcriptions, but I don't want it because you guys are different. And that's the point. It's always about being different. Better is always subjective. So it's a good question, and it's something that comes up a lot. And Captivate is built with some very unique features in mind. Now, specifically, it's all about growth. Now, what that means is that every decision we make is fueled by me wanting to grow my podcasts. And I'm a podcaster every single day. I started life in podcasting as being a podcaster. I'm not like many of the software founders that come into podcasting later. I started podcasting, got rid of my agency to then work in podcasting. So it's something that I love doing. Now, it's all growth focused. So what that means is that we'll only release things that do one of two things: directly help you to monetize and grow your podcast, or number two, save you the time that you've got the time to go and grow and monetize your show. So a great example came up. There's a question in the comments that was from Run Eat Drink podcast. No, sorry, it wasn't. It was someone else. I do apologize. It was. I always get confused with where to tell people to go for my podcast and how to subscribe. Where do I tell people? There it is, borderline. Thank you, Harmony. Where do I send people to? Well, this was a frustration of mine because it's a real pain in the neck. So we created the Captivate single subscription link. It's free. Everyone gets it. And it's just whatever your URL is, put /listen on the end, and you'll get a beautifully automatically designed page with all the relevant places to go. So, Jay, you were confused. With all those calls to action, go and listen on Spotify and Google and Amazon and Apple. With this, you don't need to be. It's just go to /listen. So that's the real differentiator. Yes, you can create multiple podcasts for one cost. We're not charging you per podcast, per feed. We don't limit your storage. There's none of that stuff. But the real kicker is the things like the listen page. It's the one-click sponsor-generated PDF media kit. I've got a sponsor coming. I've never dealt with a sponsor before. What do? Don't worry about it. Just go and click the button. There's your pitch deck. We got your back. Okay, so things like that are all intended to make your life easier, because podcasting and hosting in particular has been solved for a long, long time. But then so had fire and electricity and automation. But yet we have Teslas that drive themselves, and we've got Amazon Echoes that automate our homes. These things that we build are all about progression. It's about making podcast hosting not just about taking data, hosting it, and giving you analytics. It's about actually saying that bit's easy. We've done that bit. Let's now actually grow your podcast. So that's where Captivate fits into the market. It's a great question, Jay, and it's something that comes up a lot, and I always relish answering that, because as a podcaster, that's what I wanted when I started.
Yeah, and it's that focus of growth. I mean, that is in the title for today, Podcast Growth 101. I've really enjoyed reading your materials. When I first subscribed to Captivate and started using it for some Descript internal testing, I got on your onboarding campaign. And I will say your onboarding campaign is written as if it's all coming from you, which of course, whether it is or whether
it is,
it is, it's the brand. And it's just like that. You can wring out the authenticity out of every email. It can come across as like, wow, this Mark guy is something. And then you like see you speak, and you like go to a panel and you listen to a podcast, and it's just like you're consistent throughout. And it then helps you like, now I can understand why someone would praise the chatbot, for example, because it's just, it's that personality and that brand that you're carrying with you. And in the same way that you've talked about that and you've demonstrated that, I'm hoping that our viewers are now being like, maybe just saying, I'm going to have a podcast about cats, and then that's it. Like, no. What is it? How can you be like the British cat person? Like how can you be that? So I don't know how we're talking about cats. I don't even like cats very much.
Cats get everywhere, Jay. That's how it works. Cats are just in the internet psyche.
It is. It's the cliche of like, what would a cat podcast be about? I don't know. Tell me in the comments. So hey, we're almost at the end of our time. We have a lot of great questions that are in here that we can make sure to address in YouTube and reply as well. Mark, what's your CTA? What would you like people to do today?
Do you know what? Just get me on Twitter. If you got any questions, hit me up at Mr. Asquith. And if there's for the people who may be thinking about starting a podcast, I'm a bit of a guru buster, and I don't apologize for it. I'm a bit of a guru buster. So there's the most comprehensive how to launch a podcast course, 4 stages, a complete crib sheet, everything. It's all free with no upsell at podcastsuccessacademy.com. It's just a genuinely free resource. So go and get that if you're starting a podcast. Otherwise, be on Twitter. Fantastic.
And one of our users passes on perhaps the best advice in this past hour. They need more cats in Star Wars.
Well, I think me and Danny will have to have a little chat about that later, because I've got the Wookiees. It's all about the Wookiees.
All right, everybody. I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week with our guest, Mark Asquith, and learning more about podcast growth. Where can you find Descript? Well, why don't you reach out to us this week on Discord? So we have a user community. We're hoping that everybody gets together, talks amongst themselves, shares their best practices. There's a lot of comments that came in the YouTube feed about how to do certain things with Descript. There you'll be able to ask your peers what they're doing, see and share some examples. So use the link on the screen, join us on Discord, and we will see you all next week. Same time, same place, on a topic that I can't remember, but we'll let you know about by email. See you, Mark.